My guests today are Andrew Copson, he is Chief Executive of the British Humanist Association, and Mark Roques, who is a storyteller and Director of Reality Bites, which is the National Training Ministry of the West Yorkshire School of Christian Studies. We're asking today on the programme that gets Christians and non-Christians talking, what is the role of RE in schools? Andrew was formerly the representative of the British Humanist Association for Education, so I know this is close to his heart. And Mark has been running these workshops, especially for students of RE in many locations around the country. Well, we're going to be asking what form should the teaching of religious education take in this country? What about claims that there is too much indoctrination, or in both directions? Some interesting claims from Mark on that front. Well, welcome along, gentlemen, both, to the programme. Neither of you are stranger now. Mark, you've been with us once before, Andrew on a few occasions, and thank you for coming back in again. Let's just lay on the table, first of all, something that sort of sparked this programme to start with, and that's the fact that the government recently introduced a white paper in which, on the face of it, it looks like RE may be kind of being put more as a sideline subject. It's not being listed among the core humanities that would count towards a baccalaureate. And this has raised concerns among certain groups, especially among some Christian groups, that this could lead to, if you like, RE sort of taking a back seat in many ways. Just on the subject of RE, Andrew, did you do RE as a student?
I did do RE.
What value did you place on it?
Well, I placed a great value on it. I mean, I went to a very multicultural primary school in the Midlands where the good education we received about different religious and non-religious beliefs was very important. Probably not as important as the interaction we actually had with each other as young children from different backgrounds, but certainly very important. And in my secondary school, it was a very good introduction both to world religions and to humanism. We studied humanism in my secondary school in RE, as many people do now, along with other non-religious beliefs. And it was an excellent introduction both to those aspects of the human heritage that we're all the inheritors of, and the beliefs that people hold today. And it was also a good way of my critically testing my own emerging beliefs. And I think really they're the three reasons why we might want to teach about religions and beliefs, including non-religious ones in schools today. One, because it should help in mutual understanding if we learn something about each other.
Absolutely.
Two, because they are all part, these beliefs, of the rich philosophical heritage of humanity, as well as being living beliefs today. And also because young people will be able to test and refine and critique their own emerging beliefs and the worldview that they find they're having as a result of that good education. So I think I had that quite good, really.
So you had this positive experience. I mean, yes. Are you concerned about the way that RE is taught in any particular settings in the UK?
I think that there are so many problems with RE as a subject at the moment. The first is that, I mean, at the Religious Education Council, where I'm also a director, we commissioned a big report a couple of years ago on the teaching of RE, and we discovered that RE is still the subject in our schools that is most likely to be taught by a non-specialist. So of all the subjects that are taught in our schools, and that included even the new subject of citizenship, those teachers are the most untrained in their specialism.
That's a very good point.
And it's a real problem, that. It's a real problem. And,
yeah, I do agree with that.
There's a very patchy system of curriculum determination, which is locally determined without there being any sort of recognised national standard, which I think is a problem. There are all sorts of associations from the history of the subject. I mean, lots of people who haven't been to school for quite a while because they were at school 40 years ago have very negative views of the subject because they remember a very old-fashioned sort of Christian instruction,
yes.
Which is also a great barrier to greater public support for the subject. But also there are schools, unfortunately, where the religious education can verge on the confessional or the instructional. And then there are schools when it's just taught very badly and very shallowly and very superficially, and either of those two is wrong. So I think it's a patchy subject, but it's a very important one, and if we can get it right, then it should really contribute to young people's education in the wider sense. I think the problem that the current government should be criticised for is not so much that they've left it out of the English baccalaureate, but that they're failing to review it at the same time as they're reviewing every other subject. So there's a national curriculum review at the moment in which every subject in the national curriculum will be reviewed and will be given attention for reform. But RE is not going to be included in there because it's not on the national curriculum, even though it's compulsory. Right. And so that's the great gap, I think. I think what people should be campaigning for, what I'd certainly speak up for, is that RE as a subject should be reviewed and looked at and, tested to see if if it's fit for the purposes that we want it to meet.
Coming to you, Mark, you're sort of a practitioner in the field in a sense. You lead workshops and that sort of thing. You interact with actually the students who are actually studying RE on a regular basis. What's your view of where it's at the moment? Do you feel it's satisfactory? What's your reaction as well to this idea of it not being a core humanity?
I actually agree, with a great deal of what Andrew is saying. I think it can be taught. I must be careful what I'm saying, but it can be taught in a way that is very flat and very dry. A lot of young people I've spoken to who've had it have had a very negative feedback about it because it's been what I would call very moralistic. I did a conference where another RE teacher was talking, and it was just, this is the Christian view on this. This is the Christian view on this. And the young people were really unengaged. Now, I'm not saying all RE teachers are like that, because they're not. I know some RE teachers who are brilliant. But I think Andrew's points are totally valid, and I think it needs a massive review. And I have got suggestions into the direction in which I would like to see RE moving.
And for you, does it remain sort of one of those subjects that everybody should engage with, as it were, rather than becoming a subject which becomes very much an optional extra?
I think, like with Andrew, it depends how it's taught. And the approach that I'm working on, and with various colleagues of mine at YSOX and Damaris and other places, is what we call a worldview awareness and critical thinking approach to religious education. And this is what we've been working on in literally hundreds of conferences. We've been going into schools and doing conferences which are using this methodology. But it would take me a bit of time to explain the nuances of this approach. But it is actually quite different from the normal ways that RE is taught.
Andrew certainly objects to any confessional type of teaching of RE. Does it make a difference whether the person who teaches the subject has beliefs of their own in a particular direction? I mean, obviously you're a Christian, Mark, so when you teach, when you lead conferences and things, presumably your Christian worldview informs the way that you speak about other worldviews and that sort of thing.
Yes, but I think it's very important to be respectful and to engage in dialogue. Can I just tell a story? It's entertaining and fun, but when I was a supply teacher about 20 years ago, it was the worst job I ever had in my life. It was a really difficult job. And I went into a school and I had to cover a PE lesson. And there was a boy crying in the corner, and I went up to this boy and I said, what's your name? He said, Jimmy, sir. And I said, Jimmy, why are you upset? He said, sir, I can't go outside, sir. I can't go outside to play football. And I said, Jimmy, what's the problem? And I really, really thought that it was something serious. He was ill or something. Or he said, sir, my trainers, they only cost £20. And when I go outside, my friends will laugh at I. They'll laugh at I just can't go outside, sir. And then that evening I went to Asda. Sorry if that offends people. Because I had to buy some trainers myself.
Other retailers are available.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. But I had to buy some trainers because I love football. And I went into Asda and I went to get some. My wife was pregnant at the time. We were very hard up. So I got a cheap pair of trainers for about 15 quid. And I went up to the woman at the counter and I said, I'd like to buy these trainers. And she says, you're having a laugh, you are. You're joking. £15? My son, he wouldn't be seen dead in those trainers. The trainers he buys, they cost £120. And that's why I'm working here all the hours God sends. And I just thought there's something fascinating about this issue, about young people and the stories that they live in, the worldview stories they live in. And my heart really went out to that boy. But my heart also went out to the mother who was under enormous pressure to spend 120, I would never dream of spending 120 quid on a pair of trainers.
I don't think I ever spent it on anything.
But you take my point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in a sense, yes, every student is living in some kind of a worldview that we will be informed by. Well, I guess society is the main driver, and I guess consumerism is a key factor in that. But I mean, is that something that obviously
I don't know if that's true.
Religious views have a sort of something to say to? I mean, Andrew, do you object to the fact that I guess a lot of the time RE is being given by someone who potentially could be a Christian, you know? I mean, presumably you don't object to that.
Well, I don't think that's a problem as long as they're also a good teacher.
Absolutely.
I think that I don't buy at all this idea that just purely because someone is an atheist or a Christian or a Muslim, then they're going to be incapable of delivering a curriculum that is objective and respectful of other views. Just because it is impossible for a person to be personally neutral on every question of significance doesn't mean that they're not able to encourage young people and make other views accessible to them in the ways that will help education. So I don't buy that at all.
Well, can I just say that one of my approaches is to tell stories, and I do this because I find it engages people on an imaginative level. And my problem with a lot of RE, it can be very, very dry and very uninspiring. So a few years ago, I was watching television. This man came on the television and he said, you know, I've got this car, Vauxhall Cavalier 2.0 fuel injection. I love it. But you know what? I really love a BMW. I'd love it. The boss rings me up. He says, Dave, I've got a new car for you. I went down. And all the girls were laughing, and boys, they were laughing at me. And I thought, oh no. Got the keys, went outside, and it was a little noddy yellow Fiesta. I drove it home. My wife Brenda comes out and says, I'll not be seen dead in that car. We put a tarpaulin over it, and we both sat down and we wept. Because we felt so ashamed. And I do that, it's amusing. But I think what we need in what I call worldview awareness and critical thinking is to allow young people to reflect on this story, to really think about what I call the hidden worldview. Because there's a sense in which this man, he defines his worth in terms of a car. By the way, I should say that I used to have a yellow Fiesta, and people did laugh at me.
I think stories are a useful way of getting into a lot of important issues. I mean, when you do look at stories, especially stories that are different from your own experience, then you can begin to uncover. It's sort of like stories can make the usual world seem strange, and once something seems stranger, you can then examine the assumptions that are underlying it that you don't notice every day. And I think that's, you know, it's no coincidence that all the great religions and philosophies of the world have produced stories as one way of explaining the world around them, you know, and I think that's true.
We're going to take just a moment to I did promise some people may be surprised to hear, who maybe have not been around RE for a while, that humanism is now represented in studies. They may say, isn't it religious education? Haven't you just described humanism as a non-religious viewpoint? So for you, what's the important thing to grasp here when it comes to humanism?
Well, I mean, you know, non-religious beliefs have been taught in RE lessons in this country to some extent or another for over 40 years. I mean, that's just one of the things that has happened as the subject has grown and developed, and unfortunately it still has the same name that it did in the past, which, by the way, is a bit of an anomalous name as well, because you don't call history historical education, and you don't call geography geographical education, and so on. But non-religious beliefs, you know, it's pretty accepted. Any teacher will tell you that in their classroom there are going to be young people with all sorts of different backgrounds and worldviews, and a great number of them will very likely have a secular worldview, a non-religious worldview, one way or the other. There's a great debate always raging: is Buddhism a religion? You know, is Jainism a religion really? You know, is this, that a religion? Well, I would say it doesn't matter. If it is something that describes a certain set of beliefs and values that people are walking around the world inhabiting and carrying through in their lives, if there's something interesting to be said about them, if they've had some significant effect on human cultures both now and in the past, then let's learn about them and look at them and subject them to our own sort of critical examination.
I mean, perhaps throwing a cat in among the pigeons at this point, Mark, you actually feel that there is, in some sense, not in a sense, indoctrination towards religion through RE, which is sometimes, you know, been an issue that the British Humanist Association has brought up in certain ways it's taught. Rather, on the contrary, that there is, if you like, something of a hidden secular agenda in other areas of education. Perhaps you'd like to expand on that.
A long time ago, I wrote a book called Curriculum Unmasked, and it came out in about 1989. I wanted to argue that there is an implicit worldview in the way we teach every subject. Now, that is a very controversial claim, but there's been a lot of research since then which has been basically backing up what I was saying. But what happened is I was a supply teacher and I went in lots of schools in the Bristol Bath area, and I wanted to get a sense of what are the actual de facto worldviews of young people. Not just the kind of window dressing, but what are the real beliefs of this? And I wrote this book called The Good, the Bad and the Misled, which was what I call an approach to RE that is worldview awareness and critical thinking. And I did a lot of conferences all over England where I did, it was about my book. But what I would begin is I would say, imagine you got 10 million quid from your Auntie Ethel in Australia. What would you do with that 10 million pounds? And I found that the answers were almost the same. And I'll give you some of the answers I got. I want to spend my life shopping, partying, and going on holiday was one. I would buy a helicopter, a mansion, and a Ferrari. One girl said I would buy a windmill and live all on my own. And another one said I want to be a famous celebrity and have lots of fun. A year ago, a 5-year-old girl called Desiree Ali was the first girl to get GCSE maths at the age of 5. And she was asked about her dreams. And she says, I want to be a princess living in a big house so I can count my money. and I think that my view is that there's something very individualistic about this worldview. It's about me and my consumption. In my view, there's an implicit, what I call an economistic worldview. And this was summed up by a scholar called Brenda Watson, who wrote a book called Education and Belief. She said this, that economics is the key to life, that technology can control the future, that people matter chiefly insofar as they work, that the arts, humanities, and religion are to be seen largely as pleasant extras to be accommodated if there is time, that there is either no spiritual side to life, or if there is, it is unimportant and secondary, and that in the end there is only matter, money, and the industrial machine. Now, very quickly, I began studying French and German textbooks because I taught French. And what I discovered is that there is what I call an implicit ontology. That's a bit technical, but it means an implicit theory of what exists, how it exists, and what doesn't exist. And so what I was picking up in the textbooks that teach French was that everything was really about consumption. It was about going on holiday. It was about individuals gambling. And I studied these textbooks, and I discovered the only quote-unquote religious mention in any of them was horoscopes. Now, that to me is fascinating because what's going on there is you are mediating what I call this implicit ontology. And when I think you look at every subject, you will find there is this hidden curriculum.
I think that everyone believes that excessive consumerism is a negative thing for both people and personal relationships. That's true. I personally have doubts as to whether the case that young people are growing up with a worldview that is totally consumerist and nothing else is unproven. I think the most interesting book for me in the last few years on this was the research that was done into Generation Y, when they did that long, I think it was published actually by some sort of religious publisher, but it was research anyway that looked at young people's attitudes and values with a view to looking at the worldviews that were implicit in them. And it found that far from being excessively driven by consumerism, young people had a very clear sense of both meaning and purpose. They did find it in the here and now in this world, that's true, but they found it as much through friends and family and through the engagement with arts and music around them. So I doubt, actually, I do doubt the assertion that young people, the worldview of young people is totally consumerist in that way. I think that that if you do want to counter an excess of consumerism, then I think it would be appropriate to do that through the educational system. I do think that the educational system would be an appropriate framework for trying to broaden each child's understanding of the world that they live in, its opportunities. I think probably the education system and teachers are doing the best they can to do that at the moment. But I think that for most young people that wouldn't be found through religious education necessarily. It may be found through English literature or through art or through music or through engagement with history or through many other subjects that will add a sort of luster of meaning and engagement to young people's interaction with the world. And I think when it comes down to something like French textbooks. I've heard this more than once, not least because I think a couple of Christian teachers devised a new sort of French textbook which was all about the vocabulary of hospitality and so on to sort of counter the French. Yes, but I think, to be honest, I think that it's perfectly appropriate to teach children the vocabulary of going on holiday and shopping and doing tourist things, because that's what most people's interaction with France will be as they grow up. So it is the vocabulary that you need and the language that you need. Now, if you come on to do A-level French, then you're going to start reading French literature, and that's fine. But I do think that the curriculum can also serve a purpose. And one of the purposes for people, what I use my schoolboy French for is shopping and talking to people in France.
I can see there's a natural correlation between.
But can I comment on that?
I don't think it's necessarily an implicit consumerism behind it.
But I think one of the problems is that when I taught French, and I love French, particularly I'm a big fan of Tintin, and for me it's a joy. But when I speak to people and young people about why do we learn French, so often the answers are very, very economically focused. One boy said to me, "Do you know, I hate French, but I'm going to try because I want to get a job in Paris."
Lovely.
Yeah, but if we reduce the meaning of language learning to the economic, this is the problem. And this is what David Smith points out in his book, that he wants to argue that a Christian approach to modern language is to say, how about being a good neighbor? If you have an asylum seeker comes over, my wife works with asylum seekers, and I sometimes speak a bit of French because I can be a good neighbor. I don't want to reduce it to having a job. And where I think I disagree slightly with you is the issue of the actual de facto worldviews of young people. Now, I've done a lot of sixth form conferences, and one of the ones I've done, which I got a very powerful response, was I had a debate with teenagers about the Leopold and Loeb story, which is a fascinating story about two men who were very influenced by Nietzsche. And they basically took very seriously the idea that they had to create their own values. And in 1924, they went out and murdered a young boy of 14. And it became a national sensation, this court case. But during this court case, what was fascinating is that Leopold and Loeb's, their worldview was that it was total autonomy. We have total liberty to create our own meaning and our own values. Then Clarence Darrow, who was the lawyer who was defending them, he argued that the boys were machines. And it was a deterministic system, so they weren't actually culpable for what they did. Now, the reason I did this is I told this story and I showed a bit of Alfred Hitchcock's film Rope.
Yeah, it's a good film.
It's a fantastic film, but I got these young people to tell me in groups and debating, where do you think Nietzsche went wrong? Did he go wrong? And I found that a lot of the responses were very much, to describe their worldviews, some of them were quite pro-Nietzsche. And some of them were saying things that were very social Darwinistic. And some of their responses were very much, well, some boys would say, if people aren't clever enough, then they're worthless. And I got a lot of these responses. And only on one occasion in all these debates did I have a group of Christians saying very shyly, we think they're wrong because we believe we're made in God's image. There's a value to any human being. So what I'm saying is that we at Damaris and Wysox, we've had the experience of doing over 600 conferences. And I've spoken at length to my colleagues, particularly Peter Williams, who's done over 300 of these conferences. And he kind of agrees with me that when we start to describe the actual worldviews, they're not these Christian bylaws, they're not Christian views, they're not these kind of Kantian views that we could discuss. They tend to be David Hume, Nietzsche, Sartre, social Darwinism and species egalitarianism, but also in the mix, celebrity culture. So you get this whole thing of, I like Cheryl Cole, sir. Now, do you know how much money, Andrew, Cheryl Cole spends on her appearance every day?
I don't even know who she is.
Do you know who she is, Justin?
I know who Cheryl Cole is.
Who is she?
She's singer and judge on Britain's Got in the X Factor. I mean,
this is a thing I want to explore just for a moment. Cheryl Cole spends more than £1,000 on her appearance. So when as a philosophy teacher, was teaching Kant, at the back, you've always got some kids going, I don't know about that. I don't think Cheryl Cole would like this. Or Jordan. I love Jordan.
What would
She's
Cheryl
great.
Cole do? I see.
What would Cheryl Cole do?
We're going to take a quick break, guys, because we need to go to a break, but we'll come back with your response, Andrew. Mark, you were bringing up, just in that last section, this interesting point, and you've made it in a book you wrote a few years ago called Curriculum Unmasked, that there is what you claim is a secular and humanist assumptions behind aspects of the curriculum. You seem, though, to be equating, and I like your response to this, I suppose, Andrew. Humanism, secularism with consumerism, as though that is the natural bedfellow. I'm sure you'd possibly disagree with that. Would you, Andrew?
Absolutely. I can't see any connection with humanism and consumerism at all. Not necessarily, or no more than there is between Christianity and consumerism. Where I think I'm still in disagreement, is in this assertion that it is a fact that young people are occupying this exclusively consumerist or near exclusively consumerist mindset. There is also, quite often in my experience, a regard for other people, and I see that as much as I see sometimes the other attitudes that have been described. And I think that if we look at research that is done with young people and their attitudes, for example, the Generation Y research that I was mentioning earlier, I don't think that the evidence does exist to say that there is this exclusive consumerist worldview among young people today. I don't think there is. And many attitudes on moral questions, many indicators of concern for other people in surveys and opinion polls and social behaviour would indicate certain improvement and progress in the last few decades, rather than the reverse. So, as for the assertion that this is currently the case, I don't buy it. Is there a hidden worldview in the curriculum? Well, I think it depends what you mean by hidden, and it depends what you mean by worldview. Because, I mean, everything has something implicit behind it. That's true.
Yeah.
Is the something implicit that is hidden behind our current curriculum a worldview? I don't know.
Well, let's have a little bit more, if you like, then evidence from you at this point, Mark, because obviously Andrew disagrees necessarily that this is the prevailing attitude among young people.
Right.
He also suggests that if there is some what you term a worldview agenda at work, he's not sure that that's quite exactly what it is.
Well, it wouldn't have to be an agenda, would it? It could just be something implicit that wasn't deliberate.
I think where I think we need to have a discussion is about what is actually being said by sixth formers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I repeat this, at Damaris and Wysox, we've done 600 conferences.
Sure.
Now, you could just say it's anecdote, but I've got time after time after time, I've heard young people say things that they say uncritically that they can't actually explain. For example, I was once speaking to a boy, sixth former, who said to me, "Sir, you can't kill those wasps. Every living thing is sacred." And I said to him, "Do bacteria have rights?" And he said, "Do you know, I've never thought about that, sir." Another boy in school said, "Only facts are true. If only science is true, that means morality's up to you and you can think what you like." Now, I have encountered these emotivist views. Sure. And I think, can I just explain my point, is that there's a distinction between facts and values that is very much at the core of education in Britain. And so what you'll find is I listen to TalkSport. I'm making myself vulnerable. My wife really has a go at me for doing that, but I do. It's a weakness of mine, and I apologize for that. But often you will find footballers in the present saying, "It's a fact. It's a fact." And then they will say, "That's just your opinion." And then they'll say things like, one of these persons, it's quite funny, said, "I wouldn't get married because you can't be true to yourself." Now, this expression, being true to yourself, is very deeply in the psyche of many English people. Take Big Brother. I think we need to study Big Brother in RE. There's a fantastic story about one of the guys there who was asked about himself, and he said, "I'm hot, and I know it. Women love me. They all fancy me." Then he said this, "My mother does all the housework in my house. I don't do a thing. I don't like ugly people. They give me bad vibes. And I want to be true to myself." Now, my point is about this true to myself is I hear this all the time. My daughter says she hears people saying it all the time. And it's thought about very uncritically. Young people have not really thought about this idea of follow your heart.
You're talking about individualism, in a sense. Is that what we're talking about?
No, but the point I'm making is how can we call this education when so many young people leave schools spouting these, what I call romantic slogans, follow your heart, be true to yourself. There's a Christian university in this country, I won't name it. Its slogan is, be who you want to be. And my question is what about little Alphonse Capone? If I was speaking to him, so imagine he's 10, and I say to little Alfie, I'm sure you want to be something when you grow up. And little Alpha says, yeah, I want to be a train driver. And I say, well, do you know the most important thing, little Alpha, is that you are true to yourself. And then little Alpha goes, what does that mean? Because if you have no moral boundaries...
Oh, it doesn't mean anything.
Being true to yourself can encourage what I call an incredibly antinomian worldview.
Now, let me
but no one is saying, presumably no one is saying the education system is giving that message. Be true to yourself. I certainly agree that there's an excessive attention paid to the self in modern culture. I certainly agree with that. It leads to very worrying ideas about knowledge sometimes. So, for example, it's my opinion. Who are you to say that it's not true? Well, not all opinions are right. I think actually religious groups in the modern world benefit to some extent from that prevailing sentiment. But I don't think that that's a sentiment that is pervaded through the education system. So that's what I'm more interested about. What is it that we think in the curriculum, or that the case that you're making, what is it in the curriculum that is advancing this, this sort of individualism?
Okay, well, I think that my colleague Peter Williams, who's done extensive, of anybody in Britain, this man, Peter Williams, is a philosopher from Damaris. He's done so many conferences. Sometimes we have 150 young people for 3 hours. They are really major things. And we do a conference called Ethics in an Age of Science, and we look at the issue of free will, determinism. And what we do is we really look at the views of people like, Susan Blackmore. We look at the views of Richard Dawkins, who basically argue very clearly that we are machines and we have no free will. And they say these things very, very clearly. And we quote these people, and then we get people to discuss this issue, okay? And one of the things that we get constantly, not just me, but Peter and my other colleagues, is the idea that says only facts are real. The idea is that only physics and maths tell you about nature. And because nature is very kind of what I call, it's a thin thing. It's not much there. Only physics and maths and chemistry perhaps are hooking onto reality. Other subjects like aesthetics, ethics, these things are just not really hooking onto the way the world is. So Peter Williams and myself, we've heard time and time and time again, young people say, if it's not factual, it's a load of old rubbish, sir. Now, that is a very positivist worldview.
That is a misconception, though, I think. I think that not your misconception.
No.
If people are saying that, if young people are saying that, that is a misconception. But I still can't see how it's one that's promoted by the education system.
How would you analyse it?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, if you take someone like any superficial understanding of anything is going to produce all sorts of errors. That's certainly true. Take someone like Richard Dawkins or Susan Blackmore. My reading of their own work and of conversations with them would not lead me to believe that they believe what you've just said they believe. I think that, for example, Richard said very clearly and very beautifully once something about morality, to the extent that you don't find it in nature. It's not something that science will unveil for you in the evolution of our species. So you better go out and, human beings better be good to each other and make sure that they do try and create and sustain values for themselves. So to say that physics and maths does not account for something is not to say that that something isn't real. Aesthetics and other aspects of the humanities say important things about the reality of human experience, not the reality of the material world outside us, but the reality of our experience. But if young people aren't understanding that, that is a problem. But I can't see that the solution is anything.
It sounds to me, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, Mark, but you're making something. If I'm joining the dots correctly, you're saying that the worldview that Andrew inhabits is actually having a negative effect on the education system, in the sense that you're suggesting that the materialism, the consumerism, is a byproduct.
Hold on, why are you just attributing consumerism to
No, well, I'm not. I'm not. I'm trying to. But what you seem to be suggesting is that this consumerist sort of qualities that you notice in young people comes out of some sort of, I don't know. You mentioned Nietzsche, who obviously we say, well, it's an atheist worldview. Are you trying to make a link then between sort of atheism and the secularism that obviously exists in this country, and that somehow is then producing, because of its underlying assumptions, some kind of consumerist, materialistic, individualistic sort of approach?
I would like to challenge Andrew about, because I think that Richard Dawkins and Susan Blackmore, I've read her book, The Meme Machine, and in this book she says very, very clearly that she does not want, to quote her, nor do I want any version of free will that ascribes it to a self who does not exist. And the argument of Susan Blackmore goes like this. She says that Richard Dawkins says we must rebel against our selfish genes. And she says, hang on, what is the we that can rebel against the selfish gene? And Susan Blackmore says, actually, not only is free will an illusion, but the fact that we exist as a distinct personality is also an illusion. And she says, I agree with Richard Dawkins that we are just as it were, a colony of selfish genes and memes. Now, she says this very, very clearly. Can I just finish? Yeah. In the meme machine. And now, when young people hear this view, they're very shocked by it. And they don't like it. But they always want to say, but we have free will. Now, my point is you've got to have a much richer ontology if you are to have free will. But if you have a materialist ontology, it's almost impossible to generate notions of free will. And Richard Dawkins actually says, he says, isn't the murderer or the rapist just a machine with a defective component? And then he goes on to say, any crime, he says, is in principle to be blamed on antecedent conditions acting through the accused physiology, heredity, and environment. It's very clearly saying we have no free will. And in that sense, when the rapist does something horrible, he or she is physically determined by impersonal forces.
I mean, is it reasonable to suggest, though, that Richard Dawkins' views are actually filtering down into some geography, history lesson?
Read the meme machine by Susan
I mean, I suppose that's...
I don't think they probably haven't, have they?
No, that's a good point.
I mean, you know, and I don't think that they're so mainstream that they've collared the culture necessarily. I mean, and also I think that those quotes represent one particular snapshot of their views at one particular time. I know I'm not going to speak for Sue Blackmore or for Richard Dawkins because I'm not them and I didn't write those words. But I would be surprised if they didn't agree with me when I would say that on the question of something like free will, it is perfectly possible to sustain two propositions in relation to free will. One is to say that the universe is such and the whole process of cause and effect is such that if you want to say, do we have free will as in totally free, we can choose to act entirely outside of what's caused our behaviour, then the answer is probably no, we don't have free will. Ought we to behave as if we do have free will? Yes, we should, because in the process of our interactions with each other and the short duration of our lives, that's an appropriate way to behave. No, you know, a life lived as if determined is a very poor one, whereas a life lived as if we have free will is a very rich one, and we don't actually have to have free will in order for that life lived in that way to be meaningful and fulfilling. And if it turns out that we don't have free will, then that doesn't affect actually the meaningfulness and our experience of the life that we've had. So I think that there are statements here that operate on two levels. For me, it's the same as the question of the meaning of the universe. Does the universe have a meaning? Do our lives have a meaning in some ultimate sense? No, they don't. That's my belief. Does that mean that in our lives now, here and now, we don't feel meaning, we can't create meaning, we can't, sustain meaning between us and have a meaningful time of it? No, it doesn't. We can. Both statements are true. The universe is meaningless, but we can find meaning in our lives. And those two sorts of statements operate for me in that way. And I think that they can operate in the worldview of young people too. And give a false impression of crass materialism, which is not. What you're
accurate. Developing though is what philosophers call the philosophy of as if. I must live as if materialism is false. But actually, the rhetoric of so many people is that if naturalism is true, then if we're to be brave and honest atheists, we must accept the implications of this. It seems to me that
naturalism is true. I mean, that's...
I don't agree with that.
I mean, that's separate from what I'll be talking about in terms of determinism.
When you say naturalism is true, how does the word true hook on to nature?
Well, I think that, when we're talking about naturalism, what we're talking about naturalism is more of an assumption than many other things are. That's certainly true. But it is an assumption that is found valid repeatedly over time. Karl Popper is my favourite philosopher talking about naturalism when he goes, if you really beat a humanist down to the very, bottom of it, then, the one thing that one would have to agree is an assumption is naturalism. The assumption that things behave according to natural laws and that there's nothing supernatural about the universe, no second layer to reality. But, he goes on to say, it is an assumption that has never been proved false and has been repeatedly verified over time, and one that people rely on all the time in their normal, everyday activities whenever they get on a plane or partake in some activity that science founded on naturalism has helped them to partake of. And so I think that when it comes to naturalism, you're right, to this, some extent that it's an assumption, but I think that it's such a strong and well-founded assumption that it's perfectly legitimate to forget the fact that it's an assumption most of the time.
Well, I think I disagree with you completely about that, because I think the problem is that you have an incredibly thin ontology of just physics. I think there is a huge tension between, for example, if you really believe this materialist story, you cannot really believe that reason has any autonomy. What I mean by that is a lot of atheists have a rhetoric of we are on the side of reason, and people like me who are Christians are on the side of faith. But if you actually analyze the ontological grounding of materialism, how does reason have any connection to the cosmos if it's just molecules, atoms in the void? Now, it seems to me that rationality, it needs some kind of richer ontology. Now, I think Kant does provide this richer ontology. But you know what? He has to have two realms. He has to have the physical, and then he has to have some spiritual realm which gives home to reason. Now, this is my question to another media atheist about how do you justify rationality if materialism is true? Let me just explain my point. If it's true that we are machines and that everything we do is, as it were, understood by the impersonal laws of physics, when I am thinking right now, surely my thought now is determined by some hidden physical process. So actually it is impossible to have a rational decision-making process if materialism is true. Now, it seems to me that you have got the difficult question here as to how do you justify your belief in autonomous reason, but also your belief that your ontology is physicalistic.
Well, I don't believe in autonomous reason. I think that the acting of reason, the process of reason, is conditioned by the reality that we find ourselves in. I mean, I think that it's, reason is clearly a product of human interaction with reality. I don't think that I wouldn't deify it. I wouldn't build a temple to reason, French Revolutionary style or anything. Okay. So I don't think it is. And I don't think many people would claim that it was such a thing. I mean, because
but you're not
precisely
actually
what
answering my question. My question is,
to be honest, okay, ask it again.
My question is a technical question. I'll tell you why I asked this question, because I was at a conference where a media atheist was speaking to an entire sixth form, and he said to any Christian here, they are stupid and silly. Okay. And I went up to this media atheist and I said to him, could you explain to me where do you locate reason in your ontological framework? Is it just a product of evolution, purely physical, or does reason have a special home where it has its beauty and its touching with reality? And this philosopher said to me, I don't know how to respond to your question. And my question then was, you've just been accusing me and two or three people in this audience of being stupid and silly, but you cannot actually answer a question about reason.
Do you want to tell me what the question is again?
The question is this, okay, and I think it's a central one. It's, if we are just machines, what Dawkins says is everything we do can be explained by the laws of physics, the impersonal laws of physics. But it must mean that my thoughts and right now are secretions of the brain. So everything that I say
they could be accounted for that way. Certainly, they could be accounted for. They could be described. What had led up to that thought could be accounted for and described in purely physical terms. That's true. So is that controversial?
Well, it is.
That it could be described and accounted for. I mean, because implicit in your own worldview, if I might say so, is the idea that such an accounting for would somehow explain away and devalue that thought.
No.
Well, my view is that it wouldn't either.
No, I have a
so in what
framework.
case, what's the problem?
It's because I think the issue is that there's a connection between what I call your worldview and your ontology. Now, my ontology is a very, very rich ontology where I believe that there are many irreducible aspects to the world. So I think we have physical properties, but I think there are many properties that are irreducible to the physical. They rest upon the physical, but they're irreducible to it. So for me, logic is an irreducible aspect that you can't reduce to the physical. But in your ontology, it seems to me, you effectively must reduce the logical to the physical.
Well, I don't know what irreducible means in this context. It does seem again to imply that to explain something would be to reduce it, which is not my view. I mean, logic is the word that human beings have chosen to give to a certain process of reasoning. It has no objective existence. It's a process that we've come up with and that we apply to discover certain truths, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. It doesn't seem to me to reduce either the effectiveness or the impressiveness of human logic. So, in a sense, I can't see the problem.
I think it's a tension within your worldview.
So I don't see it that way.
I think the problem is this: it's a tension between, and I pick this up with young people, it's either autonomy or it's scientific determinism.
No, I think there is no distinction between those two things, because if we use the word autonomy to describe human behaviour, we can only ever realistically mean as much autonomy as is possible. So if some autonomy is limited by the facts of, what is determined around us, that's not a problem, because we could never really use the word autonomy to mean anything more than such autonomy that was actually possible in our lives.
Yeah.
And, total autonomy is clearly absolutely impossible, because there's a limit to our existence. I may decide that I wish to float out of this building right now.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that is how I feel, but if I did believe I would float, and that walls would represent no barriers and I would just merge through them until I floated out of the building, quite clearly I can't do that. My autonomy may lead me to have certain desires, but I can't see them all through. I can't follow them all through. Of course not. Of course I can't. So if the idea is that somehow a fact like that, the fact that I can't float out of the building at will, somehow limits or reduces the secular conception of autonomy, then I don't see that that's a sound argument.
Well, I don't think you're actually really responding. I mean, for example, William Provine, who was a professor of biology, said there is simply no room for the traditional concepts of human free will. He says, so from my perspective as a naturalist, there's not even a possibility that human beings have free will. This is a view that is being expressed by many philosophers, not just Susan Blackmore, but Patricia and Paul Churchland. And I think they are brave atheists because they are willing to go the whole hog. They're willing to say, if everything is just physical, then surely everything is governed by the laws of physics. Now, the way I analyze your position is that you seem to have some Kantian view, whereby you have something that is, as it were, hovering above the physical, that gives meaning to morality and reason.
No, not at all. Not at all. I don't see anything hovering above anything. I say that we can give meaning through the operations of through our own attribution of meaning to our experiences, because that's the sort of creatures that we are. We can do that, and we have conscious awareness, and we can reference things in that way. But I don't say that there is any objective meaning to all things floating above. Not at all. I accept that we have no free will in the sense that you're describing it.
Isn't that very nihilistic, though? Your
no,
view?
I don't think so. Why? I mean, what nihilistic consequences flow from that?
Well, it is.
I mean, that's what I believe, but I don't live in a nihilistic way.
I'll tell you where it is very nihilistic, because how can you speak about, say, Adolf Hitler doing horrible things? If he has no free will, surely Adolf Hitler has no genuine ability to choose between good and evil.
No, that doesn't follow. I mean, because what I've also said is that people have to act within, obviously within the boundaries that aren't determined. But we behave as if we have free will, and we do make choices. I mean, our conscious mind makes choices. I just don't think. I mean, the sort of free will that you're describing as the alternative to my position seems to me to be quite unachievable and indefensible. So what you have to do, I think, is to say, here is why we should believe that things are not determined, but that we do have total free will, and then defend that position, and then see where that takes you. Because I think that it would be indefensible in itself. I mean, presumably you don't accept that free will is limited at all, or you accept that you think that it's limited by something? But I mean,
personally speaking, I don't really use the word free will.
Well, I never have either until today, until you started asking about it.
The reason, can I just explain to you the concern I have is that
Can we explain that concern in a moment? Because we're going to go to another quick break. Don't be sorry. I mean, Mark, we sort of had quite an in-depth conversation between you and Andrew on whether Andrew's atheist materialism sort of means he's compelled to have to jettison, rationale and values and meaning and that sort of thing. And Andrew responded to that.
Yeah.
But where does this actually take us in terms of, are you seriously suggesting that this somehow is actually filtering through in some way to young people in the classroom, that this is determining their choices, and that this consumerist sort of mentality that you started talking about earlier on?
Well, I think that what we found, and again, I mentioned that I discussed this with my colleagues at Damaris and Wysox, is that what we find with sixth formers is what I call the darker end of secularism. We find that, celebrity circus, fascination with Cheryl Cole. We find materialism. We find emotivism. We also find species egalitarianism. But above all, we find consumerism. Tesco, ergo sum. And I think there is a connection between these views. We live as if there's no God. The story of the West has been predominantly a story that says science will make us all knowing, technology will make us all powerful, and then we will have economic growth, and then we can consume endlessly in a consumer paradise. Now, not everyone in our culture lives in this story, but the evidence we have is that a lot of young people, their horizons of happiness, that's a key term, their horizons of happiness are very materialistic. They're consumeristic. It's about me and my consumption. When I played this game about what would you do with 10 million quid, I was really hoping that a humanist might say, because I respect the humanist tradition, might have said, I'd like to use some of this money to set up an orphanage in Romania and help children. That would have been fine. Because I think humanists and Christians can actually work together on this. I don't know if you know this, Andrew, but in Holland, the Humanist Philosophy Association works with the Protestant Philosophy Association and the Catholic, and they actually together develop worldview and philosophy syllabi.
And in Belgium.
And I think here, we've had a Barney, but I think we can actually. Why don't we work together? Why don't we help each other? Because I actually do agree with you. Say about Stephen Law. I've seen some really good things in his books. I'm not the kind of Christian who says, I can learn nothing from you. Because I think that's just not helpful, that kind of debating. I want to learn. I've learned from atheists. My best neighbours, my neighbours are two wonderful people. They are humanists, and I absolutely love them. We have drinks together. We talk about Tintin and football. I love these people. I want to be friends with them. And what I'm saying is I've got a lot of friends who are humanists who I think are great. I'm not going to play the moral card there, but I'm just saying I want an educational system that helps young people to take a critical distance from what I call this very economistic worldview. I'm not saying all young people are full of this it's all about economics, but I've met so many young people, and it breaks my heart when they just see, why do I learn French? Because it's going to get me a good job.
Andrew, I mean, do you reject any suggestion, though, that stems from a sort of materialistic, in the sense of scientific materialism kind of worldview, that all there is atoms and things, and therefore we're causally determined, that this somehow is filtering down to young people to suggest, therefore, I can do what I want, because ultimately, I mean, because that seems to be partially what Mark is hinting at.
I can't see any logical connection between the two, between, if you want, sort of philosophical materialism and consumerist materialism, apart from the fact that one word happens to refer to both those separate concepts. I can't see any logical connection between the two. And in fact, obviously, in terms of humanism and the humanist tradition, humanists have often stood against, excessive consumerism and the over-economization of things, not least public services and, shared common institutions in our civic life together. obviously the British Humanist Association does work together with Christian groups, Muslim groups and Jewish groups, Hindu groups, all sorts of religious groups, not least in the Religious Education Council, to try and produce the sort of syllabus and attitude towards education about different religious and non-religious beliefs and values that will help young people get a better rounded and more genuinely educational education. I come back, I think, to the question of what young people's views today really are. Now, I mean, all our experiences in schools, both Mark's and mine, will of course be conditioned by our own worldviews. But nonetheless, when I go in to schools and run sessions with young people, I just don't seem to be picking up on the same rampant consumerism and materialism, in the bad sense, that Mark is. I don't have that view at all, and I still think that when you look at objective research that's been carried out, on a wide scale and academically, like for example the Generation Y research, and what you pick up is that young people do have an empathetic and a meaningful worldview, that it's not just Cheryl Cole and Jordan and Celebrity Big Brother, that life has more meaning to them than that. And I think that whether they are young people who grow up to be Christians or young people who grow up to be humanists, I think we can be a little bit more optimistic that either the education system or something at least in our wider society is contributing to make sure that those young people do grow up with connections to other people that go beyond the economic.
It's been fascinating to have you both on the programme today. And Mark, is your book still in print?
No, it's not. And I'm a broken man because when I published it, I think I made about £5 out of it.
You don't want to measure things in financial terms,
Mark.
But
certainly the research that I have been putting forward has been written by my colleague Arthur Jones. Has written a paper called Education, God and Indoctrination, and it's a brilliant paper that he's written, which really gets at some of these issues. In this paper, he actually explains how mathematics is taught in 3 different ways: a communist way, the way that it might be taught under the Taliban, and a secular consumerist way of teaching mathematics. And I would encourage you to read that paper. It's short, it's a joy to read, and I think it really does get this discussion going.
Well, thank you both for coming on today and sharing your views. It's been fascinating interaction today.